Welcome to part 10 of Presidents, Plutocrats, Paupers, and Populists. Now we're going to take a look at the populist movement. The populist movement was born from the plight of the tenant farmers in the South, right? Remember, a tenant farmer is anyone that's farming on somebody else's land, on rented land. Tenant farmers existed under two systems. First of all, the sharecropping system, in which they farmed somebody else's land in exchange for the landowner getting a share of the crops produced on that land. All right, that's well and good, but you got to have the supplies to farm in the first place. So the second system they operated under was known as the crop lien system, in which the farmers were allowed to purchase the items they needed in order to farm the land, again, to be paid back with the sale of the crops on the end. Now, if you have a bumper crop, this is fine. You pay off the amount you owe through the sharecropping system and the crop lien system, and who knows, after a while you build up a little bit of a nest egg, you can purchase some land that you actually own and farm it and stop being a tenant farmer. Usually that's not what happens. What happens is that you can never quite pay off that debt and you become a slave to the land itself. It's called debt peonage. You can never leave because you're constantly paying on this debt that you can never get ahead of, right? So C.W. McCune in 1877 is going to form the Southern Farmers Alliance in order to try and address these issues, the plight of these tenant farmers. And he's going to have some very prominent and very vocal members of this alliance, including Mary Lease, who was a very good writer and speaker in support of the alliance. By the 1880s, membership in the Southern Farmers Alliance had grown to over 3 million members. But one thing that I should point out, it was whites only. The African American tenant farmers were not allowed to join this alliance. As a matter of fact, they had to form one of their own and called themselves the Colored Farmer Alliance. Now, there were two major political issues or two major changes they wanted to see to the system under the populist movement. These tenant farmers and the Southern Farmers Alliance wanted to see purchase issues addressed. They felt that Southern farmers should band together and purchase equipment in bulk so that they can get the maximum price breaks, and then they could create guilds to dole out equipment purchased or begin manufacturing farming equipment themselves that can be sold at very reasonable prices. The second issue that they wanted to address is the marketing issues. They felt that they should engage in an effort to cut out the middleman. And by cutting out the middleman, they're talking about the geographic monopolies of the railroads and the landowners themselves. Pretty much their argument is, why should these landowners get a cut of our hard labor, right? So by doing these two things, their hope was to create a cooperative economy where people worked collectively together, and they replaced the capitalist system with this system of joint-owned enterprises, right? And voluntarily meeting the collective needs. Now, some people will take a look at this today and go, oh, that's socialism. Yes, it is an economic system that is very, very similar to socialism. And it's pretty much, I mean, in a lot of ways, you can definitely label this as socialism. But this is what these guys are looking for. They're basically saying, look, the capitalist system is broken and we need to replace it. By 1892, the populist movement had grown to the point that they decided to begin to get involved in the political arena, right? In Omaha, Nebraska, on July 4th, 1892, the Populist Party, also calling themselves the People's Party, had a convention, and they adopted what is known as the Omaha Platform, right? The Omaha Platform set the stage for the first attempt to try and capture the presidency. Their presidential candidate was a former member of another short-lived political party called the Greenback Labor Party, a guy by the name of James B. Weaver, right? The platform adopted there in Omaha that day was threefold. First of all, platform issue number one was that labor and the Union of Labor Forces in the United States on this day consummated shall be made permanent and perpetual. In other words, we need to have a federal policy adopted that recognizes the rights of labor unions to exist and their rights to collectively bargain. Platform number two said, wealth belongs to him who creates it, and every dollar taken from industry without an equivalent is robbery. This is that cutting out the middleman thing, that those who do the labor should be the ones who reap the benefit. Platform issue number three, A constitution amendment needs to be put in place for government workers to be regulated under strict guidelines to increase their power amongst the national administration. In other words, they're talking about federalizing certain types of industries, specifically the railroads. They want the railroads placed under federal jurisdiction, federal control, so that you can no longer have these geographical monopolies, right? So they want to change how government in general worked, right? They wanted the capitalist system to be dismantled and replaced with this cooperative economy. So as a result, they wanted to see things like, for example, in finance, they wanted a national currency that was issued only by the general government, no issuing of bank paper debt, right? And the free coinage of silver and gold. In other words, the establishment of a silver standard. They wanted to do that because currently the U.S. government was backed by just gold. It was on the gold standard. By backing it by silver too, there's a lot more silver than there is gold. It would cause inflation, right? Now, is inflation good? Well, it can be. It can be if you have a lot of debt. Remember, the people that they're trying to help are these tenant farmers that have this tremendous amount of debt, this debt peonage. Inflation causes debt to be worth less, right? Because whereas before, like say you're selling grain for $1 a bushel, inflation allows you to sell it for $2 a bushel, your debt didn't increase at the same time. So it's easier for you to pay that debt off. Kind of see what I'm getting at there. They wanted a gradual income tax, and they wanted, of course, land regulation as well, right? Mineral resources are the property of the federal government. A federalization of resources, so people like Rockefeller can't monopolize things like oil production in the United States. So the 1892 attempt to capture the brass ring, if you will, by running James B. Weaver under the Populist Party is going to make some inroads. They are going to have some successes, but I mean, they don't even sniff at the presidency. In 1892, Grover Cleveland very easily wins election over Benjamin Harrison, and the Populist Party doesn't really make much of a showing. So in 1896, the Populist Party decided they needed to try a different tactic. In 1896, the Populist Party decided that they needed to select for their candidate one of the major candidates being supported by the two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. All right. Their candidate of choice was William Jennings Bryant, because William Jennings Bryant was everything that the Populists wanted. Right. He was a Democratic senator who had managed to become the Democratic candidate for president there in 1896. But he also had a lot of the values that the Populists loved, including the support of switching onto a silver standard, right? Matter of fact, at the Democratic Convention, he's going to give a very famous speech. He was a great speaker, which is now referred to as the Cross of Gold speech, and where he attacked the gold standard, and he stated, "If they dare come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we shall fight them to the uttermost, having behind us the producing masses of the nation of the world. Having behind us the commercial interest and the labor and interest of all the toiling masses, we shall answer their demands to a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." This was the kind of speaker that William Jennings Bryan was, and the Populists loved it. So they endorsed him along with the Democratic Party, and I mean, he goes out on the campaign trail. Now remember, I'd said before, it used to be you didn't go out and campaign yourself. You let other people do this. Remember when we talked about Charles Guiteau, for example. Not William Jennings Bryan. He went on a campaign tour. He traveled around the nation in 1896. He went around meeting people, giving speeches. It's estimated that he spoke to approximately 5 million people during his campaign for the presidency. This certainly had the Republicans worried. The Republican candidate was a pro-industry candidate named William McKinley. He was the capitalist candidate, right? One of them supporting the cooperative economy, William McKinley supporting capitalism. And of course, he's got a lot of financial backing from the different major corporations out there. One of them we'll talk about again later when we talk about Hawaii. Again, that's a subject for another time. Okay, Mark Hanna, who was a senator but also a good political handler and a leader of the Republican Party, was the campaign manager for McKinley and was really concerned with Bryan's wide-ranging campaign tour. So what did he do instead? Well, he didn't tell William McKinley he needed to go out and campaign everywhere, and William McKinley probably wouldn't have done it anyways. But what he did do is he began what was called a back porch campaign. People would come to McKinley's home there in Ohio, and McKinley would step out on the back porch and give a campaign speech, and people would come from pretty far away to come see McKinley speak. Mark Hanna would promote this. Come see your next president, right? So, what do we have here? We have William Jennings Bryan, the promoter of the populist agenda, the promoter of the cooperative economy, and on a nationwide campaign tour against William McKinley, supported by big business, doing a back porch tour. Who's going to win? Well, on the surface, you would probably say William Jennings Bryan. He's talking to more people. He's saying stuff that the working class would definitely like to hear. And there's certainly more working class voters than industrialist tycoons, so he should win. But he doesn't. Matter of fact, William McKinley gets 61% of the Electoral College and 51% of the popular vote. He wins rather handily. So what the heck happened here? Why did Bryan lose? If he's the people's candidate, why did the people not vote for him? Well, honestly, it comes down to that idea of the cooperative economy. As tempting as that might seem for individuals, the one thing that people really do fear more than anything else is change. This is why when you take polls and you ask people, what do you fear the most often what wins is death, right? Death is the ultimate change. Do you know what's going to happen after death? Well, we all have our beliefs, but ultimately, we're going to find out when we get there, right? People really do fear change, and the more drastic the change, the more they fear it. Remember, the Populist platform calls for getting rid of capitalism altogether, throwing it out, and revolutionizing the system by replacing it with a cooperative economy. This is why the progressive movement will be much more successful. It's about reform, not revolution. Revolution was just too radical, and people couldn't stomach it. So ultimately, after this campaign, the populist movement is going to die out, and from the ashes of that phoenix will rise progressivism, which at least will be a little bit more successful. Now, there is actually a eulogy to the populist movement. It was written by L. Frank Baum, and it was published in 1900, right? Its working title was From Kansas to Fairyland, but you probably know it better by its final title, The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz, which later on in 1939 becomes a movie, is a eulogy of the populist movement. And there's a ton of symbolism in this movie that shows the death of the populist crusade. Pretty much every aspect of this movie represents some aspect of the populist movement. Like, for example, Dorothy. Who is Dorothy? Well, she represents the American people. I mean, look at her. She's plucky, she's good-natured, a little bit naive. She comes from Kansas, which is middle America, and Dorothy is swept up in the colorful populist cyclone, right? So even the tornado has some symbolism. She is swept up to a land called Oz, right? The entire land is called Oz. Remember that city, there's the Emerald City. Oz is the entire place. And what happens if I put a little period at the end of Oz? Now I have the abbreviation for ounces, like in Troy ounces of gold, the gold standard. And that gold standard is represented here too. The yellow brick road, that represents the gold standard. And where does the yellow brick road start? Not where the Munchkins are. It actually originates from the Emerald City. The Emerald City, of course, representing Washington, D.C., the home of the greenback, hence emerald. then the gold standard comes out of there, and where does it go? It goes to, if you take a look here, you see it spirals and leads to nowhere. And then, of course, we have Dorothy's famous silver slippers, right? I know you're going, wait a minute, no, they're ruby. In the movie, they were ruby. Why? Technicolor. Silver doesn't pop. These things do. I've actually seen, there's several pairs of these. I've seen one of the pairs that were on display at the Smithsonian, one of the tackiest looking pair of shoes you ever see in your life, right? But in the book, they're silver because they represent the silver standard. Because remember, that silver standard is going to trod all over the gold standard, the yellow brick road, right? And so the silver standard is represented by Dorothy's shoes. It also, of course, leads to one of the most frustrating moments in the movie. When you watch the movie and Gilda, the Good Witch of the North, said, you had the power to go home all the time. All you do is click your heels together. And I really want Dorothy just to punch her in the mouth at that time. I'd be sitting there screaming. It's like, are you kidding me? I could have gone home from the beginning. I was chased by flying monkeys, for God's sake, right? But, you know, I guess it would make the movie pretty darn short had they done that. And there's all kinds of other symbolism in this movie, right? Now, this is the best ad I've ever seen for this movie, right? Transported to a surreal landscape, a young girl kills the first person she meets and then teams up with 3 strangers to kill again. It's not wrong. But just some last little bit, some examples of the symbolism in this movie. We've got the Good Witch of the North, right? She represents New England, a populist stronghold. The Good Witch of the South represents the American South, another populist stronghold. The Wicked Witch of the East, the one that the house fell on, represents Eastern financial interests. The Wicked Witch of the West represents Ohio, the Midwest, where McKinley was from, right? The Munchkins were Eastern workers who didn't vote for Bryant. The Flying Monkeys, yep, symbolism there too. They were journalists who constantly hounded the Populists. The Scarecrow represented Western farmers who didn't vote for Bryant because they just didn't have a brain. The 10 Woodsmen were Eastern steel laborers who didn't vote for Bryant because they just lacked the heart. The Cowardly Lion, well, that's William Jennings Bryan himself. The Wizard, here's the interesting thing. The Wizard, if you remember from the movie, the big screen there, that, which they thought was the Wizard, that's William McKinley. But the man behind the curtain, that is Mark Hanna, McKinley's political handler. And then finally, let's take a look at what happens to the Wicked Witch there at the end, right? Remember, she gets doused in water and she melts. Well, she was liquidated.